Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into something that's been shaping headlines out of China for quite some time now. The government's ramped up regulation of its massive tech sector. If you've seen news about giants like Alibaba facing these, enormous fines, or the sudden halt of Ant Group's highly anticipated IPO, or even the rapid troubles for Didi right after its U.S. listing, well, you might be left scratching your head wondering what's really going on underneath it all.
It's easy to look at those events in isolation, isn't it? They can feel like sudden, kind of punitive crackdowns. But the material you shared offers a really compelling framework for understanding the why behind it all. It suggests much of what we're seeing is actually intricately linked to a specific financial structure called the VIE scheme. And it indicates China is deliberately moving into a new phase of, well, economic development.
Ah, the VIE scheme. Right. Our source pegs this as a core element. It describes how this, clever financial maneuver, initially just a workaround, it evolved into this significant gray area that's now central to the government's push for things like fair competition and overall economic stability.
That's right. And what's fascinating in the source is how it connects these seemingly disparate events, the fines, the Didi situation, the whole Alibaba story, and shows how they actually fit together, pointing back to this underlying structure and the government's broader strategic goals.
So our mission for this deep dive is clear then. Using your source material as our guide, we're going to try and uncover the why behind these regulations. We'll explore the history and the nuts and bolts of the VIE scheme and see how it all fits into China's larger economic narrative.
Exactly. We'll take those specific examples right from the source, the fines, the Didi saga, that complex history of Alibaba and Ant Group, and understand how they are, well, manifestations of this deeper shift and the government's objectives.
Okay, let's unpack this and see what insights your source holds for us. So your source kicks off by pointing to the most visible signs of this increased government action on tech over the past year or so. We've all seen the headlines, I think, but the source gives us the specifics, including some pretty massive fines.
Exactly. The details that enormous 18.28 billion yuan fine, that's roughly 300 billion yen, right, levied against Alibaba back in April 2021. The reason given in the source was an anti-monopoly violation related to what's called choose one of two.
Choose one or two.
Yeah, basically forcing vendors on their platform, Taobao, not to list on competing e-commerce sites, a classic monopoly concern.
Right. And it wasn't just Alibaba taking the heat, was it? Tencent also faced an anti-monopoly fine, though smaller, 500,000 yuan in July 2021.
The source links us to Tencent Music's acquisition of China Music Group. Apparently, that deal gave them over 80% of music copyrights, made it pretty difficult for competitors to get a foothold.
Okay. And Meituan, the food delivery giant.
Yes, they got hit too. A significant fine of 3.442 billion yuan in October 2021. Also for anti-monopoly practices specifically, the source says, forcing restaurants into these exclusivity agreements.
And the source lists others too, like Baidu, JD.com.
Yeah, Baidu, Suning, JD.com, ByteDance, Didi. Quite a few well-known names received anti-monopoly related penalties, according to the source.
But it wasn't just about anti-monopoly, was it? The regulation also targeted specific sectors quite directly. Your source highlights the gaming industry, for example.
Oh yeah, big time. It notes the really strict rules limiting minors' kids, basically to just 1 hour of online gaming, and only on Friday, Saturday, Sunday evenings and holidays. That's it.
And the source even mentions some pretty pointed language from state media.
It does. Calling gaming addiction spiritual opium or an electronic drug, that certainly signals the government's view.
And obviously had a clear impact on companies like Tencent, right?
Definitely. And the education sector felt an even more dramatic impact, according to the source. It describes how after-school tutoring and these online learning platforms, the ones focused on school curricula and exam prep, they were effectively shut down.
Shut down?
Yeah, leading to what the source actually calls the collapse of that entire industry.
Wow. A collapse. So if you just saw these specific actions, the fines, the gaming restrictions, the education bans, you might conclude, well, as the source mentions, some initially did, that the government was just, bashing tech companies because they're annoying.
Right. But your source really pushes back on that idea, calls it childish.
Right.
It argues quite strongly that these issues weren't actually new. Things like choose one of two or concerns about gaming addiction. These had been discussed and raised by the government for years.
So not out of the blue then?
Not according to the source. It suggests that current actions aren't arbitrary attacks, but rather represent normal operation for the Chinese government's approach to regulation.
Normal operation. Okay, what does the source mean by that?
Well, this concept of normal operation is a really key insight from your source. It describes China's typical pattern, or at least the pattern the source sees. When a new industry, or maybe a novel business model emerges and starts growing really, really rapidly,
Yeah.
the government often initially steps back. They don't immediately pile on heavy regulations.
Right. They kind of let it run for a bit,
Yeah.
allow space to experiment and find its feet.
Exactly. But, and this is the crucial part, according to the source, regulation tends to be applied all at once later on.
All at once.
Yeah. This usually happens when that initial explosive growth starts to slow down, or maybe more often, when the negative side effects of the new model become really prominent and start causing systemic issues.
Okay.
The goal, the source suggests, is often about ensuring fairness across different industries and dealing with the downsides that pop up. And, I mean, let's be honest, legal frameworks naturally take time to catch up to rapid innovation anywhere, right?
True. So for these tech companies, it was like a race against time. Innovation often began in what the source calls these gray zones areas without clear legal rules.
Ah.
So success wasn't just about having a great product. It was about scaling up incredibly fast, getting big enough.
Before that inevitable wave of regulation hit. Exactly. Speed was crucial. And the source makes an interesting point here. For many of the companies that got those big anti-monopoly fines, while their stock prices definitely took a hit, it wasn't necessarily fatal.
Why not?
Well, part of the reason, the source suggests, is that the prospect of eventual regulation was to some extent already priced in. The companies themselves kind of anticipated that these gray zones wouldn't last forever. They'd likely prepared for it somewhat.
Okay, that makes sense. But now let's pivot to the Didi situation, because your source frames this quite differently. It wasn't just a large fine, it felt like a different dimension of government action.
It really does stand out in the source's analysis, yeah. Let's just recap the timeline it provides, because it's pretty stark. Didi filed its prospectus with the U.S. SEC on June 11th, 2021.
Okay.
Just 19 days later, June 30th, it listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Big IPO. Price reportedly jumped 19% initially.
So far, so good. But then...
Almost immediately after,
Yeah.
July 2nd, the Cyberspace Administration of China, the CIAC, announced a cybersecurity review of the Didi app. And the reason cited was to protect national data security and public interest. Crucially, they also immediately halted new user registrations.
Wow. Just 2 days after listing.
Exactly. And then just 2 days after that, July 4th, the review results were announced. Didi app distribution was banned from app stores. Reason given, illegally collecting personal information.
Banned from app stores. What did that actually mean for users?
Well, the impact was pretty severe, according to the source. Existing users could still use the app if they already had it, but no new users could sign up. And crucially, no more app updates.
Which would hinder any new service rollouts, right?
Yeah, totally. And if an existing user deleted the app for some reason, they couldn't reinstall it. Gone.
Ouch.
Yeah. This chain of events led to a massive collapse in Didi's stock price, plunged the company into a major crisis. It even caused issues for major investors like SoftBank, as the source notes.
So the source asks the critical question here, why such an extreme response? Why would the government potentially cripple a leading domestic company like that?
Right. Why hurt the economy potentially? The severity, the source argues, pointed to a target beyond just anti-monopoly behavior or data collection issues alone. This felt like punishment in a different dimension.
And the source concludes this dimension was...
The VIE structure itself, the variable interest entity scheme. The severity pointed directly at that, according to the source.
Okay, so VIE, let's break down what that actually is based on the source. Variable interest entity.
Right. The source explains it as a mechanism primarily used to, well, get around foreign investment restrictions in certain sectors in China.
Get around them.
The structure usually involves setting up a shell company or a dummy international company, often in a low-tax place like the Cayman Islands.
Okay, a shell company offshore. And this is where foreign investors put their money, where they buy shares.
Precisely. Now, the actual business operations, running the app, managing the platform, all that stuff that happens in a separate domestic Chinese company.
Right.
But the key connection between the domestic operating company and the offshore international company, it isn't traditional ownership. One doesn't own shares in the other.
So how are they linked?
It's purely contractual. It's a relationship built entirely on agreements, not on capital ownership.
Contracts dictate everything. Governance, profits.
That's it. These contracts cover governance control and, importantly, how profits flow from the domestic company to the offshore one, often structured as, like, technical service fees or intellectual property licensing fees.
So legally speaking,
Yeah.
where does this structure stand?
That's the tricky part. Your source describes this structure as not explicitly illegal under Chinese law, but critically, it also lacks a clear legal basis. It exists firmly in that gray zone.
A gray zone, meaning risky.
Very risky.
Yeah.
Because that status means regulation could hit at any time through various government actions like notifications or opinions, or eventually formal laws explicitly banning or changing it.
Okay, so to understand why this slightly precarious gray zone structure even came about, we need to step back a bit, right?
Okay.
Look at China's economic history. The source ties it back to the reform and opening up policy, started in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. That pivot from a plan to a market economy.
Exactly. At that time, China desperately needed foreign funds and technology. They were trying to rebuild, after decades of isolation, the Cultural Revolution. The strategy was to attract this foreign capital, initially through those special economic zones like Shenzhen, remember those?
Yeah.
And later expanded through economic and technological development zones in major cities, Shanghai, Tianjin, Guangzhou.
But at the same time, the government wanted to protect certain domestic industries, didn't they? And maintain control, especially over sensitive areas like information.
Right. So the Ministry of Commerce created the Foreign Investment Industrial Guidance Catalog, basically a negative list. It restricted foreign investment in specific sectors.
And this list had different categories.
Yep. It divided industries into restricted, where foreign ownership was limited, often requiring joint ventures with Chinese partners. The source uses car manufacturing JVs as examples, Toyota with GIC motor or SAIC GM Willing.
Okay. And the other category.
Prohibited, where foreign investment was simply not allowed at all, full stop.
And the source highlights that many internet-related sectors fell into that prohibited category, especially looking at the 2017 list it references.
Absolutely. Things like internet news services, online publishing, broadcasting, internet cafes, even selling cultural goods online, except music, public information services via the internet, all prohibited for foreign investment.
So that created a problem, right? If a foreign company wanted to offer internet services in China.
They couldn't just set up a normal subsidiary where they owned the majority stake. No way. They had to establish a domestic Chinese company and then use contracts to link it back to their foreign structure, usually just to get profits out via fees.
But the real challenge maybe arose for the domestic Chinese tech startups themselves. To compete and grab market share in these super fast-moving internet sectors, they needed huge amounts of initial capital, right?
Massive amounts. And as this source explains, back in the early 2000s, domestic funding sources in China just weren't there at that scale. Very few domestic venture capital firms existed before the 2010s. Traditional banks. Extremely reluctant to lend to unprofitable startups.
The source had that anecdote about banks wanting huge deposits.
Yeah, basically demanding you deposit 200 million yuan if you need 100 million to get a loan. Not helpful for a cash-strapped startup.
And not many rich individuals or corporations willing to make big bets on tech yet.
Exactly. The ecosystem just wasn't mature. So the only viable source for the huge funding required was, counterintuitively, foreign investment.
But wait, you just said internet services were on the prohibited list for foreign investment.
Precisely. You see the contradiction? That's the core problem the VIE scheme was designed to solve. The VIE scheme was essentially the tricky technique, the loophole, developed by clever lawyers and entrepreneurs to square that circle. It allowed domestic startups to access that vital foreign capital.
While appearing, on the surface at least, to comply with the foreign investment rules by having the actual operating company be domestically owned, just linked by contract.
Exactly. That was the workaround.
So if the VIE scheme was this legal workaround in a gray zone, kind of risky, why did the government tolerate it for so long? Your source must address that.
It does, and it offers some pretty clear reasons. It points out that these tech companies, the ones using foreign capital access via VIEs, they contributed enormously to China's development. Massively.
How so?
Well, they built critical infrastructure, like the logistics networks needed for e-commerce. Think about package delivery across China. They created millions of jobs, often high-paying ones for engineers and tech workers, and they empowered countless small businesses, giving them platforms to reach customers they never could have before.
Right. Huge economic impact.
Huge. And critically, from the government's perspective back then, they did all of this using foreign money, not state resources. They were driving economic and social evolution without really burdening the domestic financial system.
Which meant, as the source notes, the government didn't have a strong incentive to crack down while these companies were in that beneficial growth phase. Makes sense.
Yeah, and the source also mentions how many tech companies actively engaged in public service and welfare initiatives. This wasn't just good PR, it helped demonstrate their value to society, which was likely viewed pretty positively by the authorities.
Okay, so this tolerance helps explain why VIEs persisted. And this structure also made overseas listing attractive, didn't it? Particularly in the US, like on NASDAQ.
Definitely. The source contrasts this with the challenges of listing domestically in China, Shanghai, Shenzhen, or the newer Beijing exchange. Historically, and still to some extent, these markets had very strict requirements. You needed proven profitability, significant scale.
The source mentioned needing over 300 million yuan in revenue for 3 years straight.
Exactly. Impossible for most early-stage tech startups burning cash to grow.
And the process itself was slow.
Incredibly slow, according to the source. Could take 2 to 5 years just to get approval. In the tech world, that's an eternity. Your business model could be obsolete by then.
Plus, issues with share structures.
Right. Domestic markets typically didn't allow dual-class shares. That's the structure where founders can sell shares to raise money, but keep control through special voting rights.
Which is important for founders worried about hostile takeovers, right?
Very important. Without it, you risk losing control as you dilute your ownership raising capital.
And there was also a lockup period after listing domestically.
Yeah, 12-month lockup, maybe intended to stop founders just listing to cash out, but it also restricted liquidity for early investors and founders.
So compared to all that, overseas markets look pretty good.
Especially NASDAQ, yeah. Highly appealing, much faster listing processes. And crucially, they readily allowed those dual-class share structures, a major draw for founders wanting to keep governance control.
And the VIE structure itself made this possible.
Yes, because the entity that received the foreign investment was the offshore shell company. And that offshore entity was the one that could list directly on the foreign exchange.
Smooth.
Hong Kong was another option too, right? Also overseas, accessing foreign capital?
It was, although historically it had some similar restrictions on share types as the mainland exchanges. That's changed more recently, making it more attractive too.
Okay, so VIE enabled funding and overseas listing. But despite these advantages, it always carried risks, didn't it? And faced criticism from both sides.
Absolutely. From the US side, where many of these companies listed, the main concern highlighted by your source is investor protection. How so?
Well, if you bought shares in that offshore VIE entity listed on the NYSE or NASDAQ, you weren't actually a direct shareholder in the real operating company back in China that runs the business.
Right. Your ownership is based on those contracts.
Exactly. Solely on the contracts between the offshore entity and the domestic one. And the source points out the inherent risk. Those contracts could potentially be altered, maybe even disregarded, by the owners of the domestic company or the main shareholders of the offshore holding company.
Which could potentially harm minority investors' rights, leaving them with little recourse.
That's the concern, yes. And on the Chinese government side, the concern is simpler, really. It's that the VIE scheme is fundamentally exploiting a legal loophole. It's operating in that gray zone.
Which means it could be shut down.
Always that risk. The government could, at any moment, issue a new opinion or a notification, or eventually pass a formal law that explicitly prohibits it or drastically changes the rules. And, as the source notes, this could cause great confusion and potentially lead to the whole structure collapsing for companies relying on it.
Did companies acknowledge this risk?
Oh, yes. The source points directly to Alibaba's own prospectus for its big NYSE IPO. It apparently included a specific risk disclosure stating they might face punishment, maybe even have to forfeit profits derived through the VIE contracts, if the Chinese government decided those contracts violated foreign investment rules.
So they knew.
They knew. And this, the source argues, reinforces the idea. The government tolerated it while it was beneficial, but the regulatory risk was always hanging there. It would likely materialize when the benefits lessened or the downsides grew too large.
Let's use Alibaba and Alipay, which became Ant Group, as a case study here. Your source digs into their long history with VIE, right?
It does, and it's a really illustrative example of these complexities. The source explains Alipay started inside Alibaba, but got spun out into a subsidiary way back in 2004 as it grew. That became the core of Ant Group.
Okay.
Then, fast forward to 2011, China tightened regulations on payment services. You needed a third-party payment license. And crucially, this payment services business was designated as prohibited for foreign investment. back to that negative list issue.
Right. But Alibaba itself used the VIE scheme with big foreign investors like SoftBank and Yahoo involved offshore.
Exactly. So that foreign link made it really complicated for Alipay, as part of that structure, to get the necessary domestic payment license. It looked like foreign influence in a prohibited sector.
So what did they do? What did Jack Ma do?
Well, to get around this regulatory hurdle, Jack Ma, as described in the source,
Yeah.
basically transferred the ownership of Alipay out of the Alibaba VIE structure. He moved it into two separate domestic Chinese investment companies controlled by him personally.
Ah. So the rationale presented was, look, Alipay is now owned by Chinese individuals, domestically, no longer linked to the foreign-backed Alibaba VIE. Problem solved.
Kind of. But the connection wasn't completely severed, according to the source. There was still a crucial contract between Alibaba and the newly independent Alipay Group.
A contract for what?
Under this agreement, Ant was supposed to pay Alibaba 37.5% of its profit, framed as technology and IP usage fees.
So a way to extract profit back to Alibaba, even without direct ownership.
Pretty much. It functions somewhat like a parent-subsidiary relationship economically, even if the ownership structure was different, and governance was still effectively under the control of Alibaba and Jack Ma.
How did the actual shareholders of Alibaba, like SoftBank and Yahoo, react to this? They just lost the most valuable part, right?
Understandably, they weren't thrilled initially. The source mentions they protested because, the most profitable division was transferred out from under them. Jack Ma reportedly explained the situation after the fact and managed to get post-facto consent, but it was controversial.
So this history meant that for a long time, saying Alibaba's Alipay wasn't technically accurate because of that separate ownership.
Exactly. Even though the economic ties and control remained strong via contract, it was complicated.
Did Alibaba try to fix this later? The source mentioned some moves.
It does, and notes that later on, Alibaba seemed to take steps aimed at addressing this lingering VIE issue. In November 2019, they did that secondary listing in Hong Kong using a different market, but still accessing foreign capital. And then in December 2019, Alibaba actually acquired a 33% stake in Ant Financial, partially reestablishing a direct capital ownership link.
Okay, so try and bring it back into a more standard structure.
It looked that way. And Ant Group's own attempted mega IPO in 2020, aiming for those dual listings in Hong Kong and Shanghai, that was seen by the source as part of this broader effort to transition Ant into a purely domestic company, maybe finally unwind the VIE complexities entirely.
But then came the dramatic halt right before the listing.
Yep. Authorities summoned key people from Alibaba, Ant, the exchanges, cited concerns over Ant's compliance with new listing requirements. Officially, Ant announced it was voluntarily suspending the IPO.
And your source's interpretation of that halt?
It interprets this as the government basically signaling, hold on, you haven't sufficiently addressed or resolved these underlying issues, particularly related to the VIE structure and financial regulation.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about Jack Ma's speech. The source downplays that.
It does. It acknowledges the popular theory that Jack Ma's critical speech at the Bund Finance Summit in October 2020 angered regulators and caused the halt. But the source suggests while that might have been a trigger, it probably wasn't the main underlying reason, noting Ma had actually made even stronger criticisms before without such drastic consequences. The core issue, it argues, was structural.
Okay, so let's bring this all together now. How does this whole history of the VIE scheme, the government's tolerance, and then these specific cases like Ant and Didi, how does it connect to the current regulatory intensity?
The source's argument is pretty clear. The government tolerated the VIE loophole for years because it worked. It effectively harnessed foreign capital to fuel this incredible period of tech growth and innovation in China.
But things change. That era of hypergrowth is slowing down now.
Right. And along with that explosive growth came the downsides, problems like monopolies, unfair competition, widening inequality. These are now seen as major issues needing attention.
So the government's focus is shifting.
Deliberately, according to the source, it wants to regain direct control over how foreign capital is used within China. And it wants to dictate where and how its leading companies access public markets.
Yeah.
The aim is for this to be a more strategic, planned process led by the government.
And the Didi situation listing overseas via VIE, just as the government was tightening the screws on VIEs, that's presented as a prime example of this policy shift hitting a company really hard.
Exactly. Didi's timing was, in retrospect, terrible. They walked right into the regulatory storm targeting the very structure they used to list. The source even speculates that Didi's future viability might depend on pivoting to completely new business areas away from ride-sharing. implying that the core business, listed overseas under that VIE structure, might just not be sustainable in the long run under this new regulatory environment.
So looking ahead, what's the trend? Chinese tech companies wanting capital.
The source anticipates they'll increasingly need to dismantle their VI structures. They likely have to opt for listings on domestic Chinese exchanges, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, or maybe in Hong Kong, but crucially, under stricter government guidance and oversight.
And less freedom to list on NASDAQ or NYSE.
Further interference or pressure regarding U.S. listings seems likely, based on the source's analysis. The overall conclusion here isn't that the government wants to destroy its tech industry. Far from it. Instead, it's about normalizing the regulatory landscape, bringing those gray areas into the formal legal framework, making things black and white. And it's about the government taking back the lead in strategically managing how foreign investment is used within the country.
And this regulatory shift isn't happening in isolation, is it? Your source places it within a much bigger picture, China's overall economic transition.
Precisely. The era of, double-digit or even 7% plus high-speed growth is basically over. China is moving towards a more sustainable, stable growth rate, maybe in the 3–4% range going forward.
And for this new phase, stability and fairness become more important.
That's the argument. For this new phase of stable growth, the source argues that establishing a fair competition environment is crucial. This means actively addressing those monopolistic practices, the choose one of two stuff, the unfair advantages that emerged during the less regulated high-speed growth period.
And the source brings in common prosperity here, that big theme in China right now.
Yes, as a major driving theme. A focus on wealth distribution, reducing the vast inequalities that developed alongside the growth. The source uses that powerful image comparing fancy shopping malls in Shanghai to rural villages, saying they seem like different countries.
Highlighting the perceived need for more progress on wealth distribution, even if overall poverty has reduced.
Right, and the source connects this directly back to the regulations. It argues that moving to stable growth requires fixing these structural issues like the unregulated VIEs, like unfair business practices. The government is deliberately shifting its priority away from just raw growth, even growth fueled by gray zones, towards prioritizing stability, fairness, and a more equitable distribution of wealth.
The source had that interesting analogy, the theater effect.
Yeah, I like that one. Everyone stands up to see better, but in the end, nobody's view improves and everyone is just more tired. It suggests the cost of that hyper-competitive, unregulated growth and maybe the need for a more ordered system now.
But the source also acknowledges that innovation often needs those gray zones initially, right? It mentioned Google examples.
It did. It acknowledged that innovation often starts by pushing boundaries. Pointed to early Google products like Search, Street View, News, Books, all faced legal questions initially. And it argues Chinese tech grew the same way, pushing boundaries with things like mobile payments and definitely with VIEs.
And it included that anecdote about Jack Ma knowing the risks.
Yeah, reportedly operating with the awareness that they were constantly pushing legal limits, feeling he could be arrested at any time, suggests a long-standing understanding of the risks involved in operating in the gray.
So the government's current actions are about cleaning up those gray zones.
That's the source's final point on this. The government is now actively formalizing laws and regulations for these areas, clearly sorting things into white, legal, and black, illegal.
Right.
This is presented as a crucial step for China as it prepares for its next era of development.
Okay, so based on everything in your source, the key takeaway for us, for you listening, is perhaps to adjust how we interpret future news about the Chinese government and its tech sector.
Right. Instead of automatically framing it as just crackdowns or the government bashing successful companies, the source encourages us to view these actions through a different lens. The government proactively trying to create a fair competition environment. And deliberately preparing for a new era of stable, planned growth where they maintain strategic control, including over how foreign capital gets used.
And the source makes a compelling case that understanding this deeper context, this history with VIE and the shift in strategy, fundamentally changes the amount and quality of insight you can gain from following the news.
It really does put things in a different light.
So there you have it. We've journeyed from those initial headlines about huge fines and banned apps, all the way to understanding this, well, pretty sophisticated financial structure, the VIE scheme, and a deliberate major shift in China's overarching economic strategy.
Absolutely. It becomes less about just punishing individual successful companies, although that happens, and much more about the government reasserting control over the whole economic landscape. As the nation transitions from that phase of a rapid, somewhat chaotic expansion to one focused on stability, fairness, and strategic plan development. The VIE scheme, once this necessary, almost ingenious workaround that fueled so much growth, became something the government ultimately felt it needed to bring firmly under its direct control.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Thinking about this shift, from gray zones to more black and white regulation. What does this actually mean for innovation in China in the years to come? If the very space that fostered that initial explosive growth is being formalized, maybe constrained, how will the next generation of tech breakthroughs emerge? Where will they come from?
That's a huge question. And equally, for you as a global investor, or maybe a company looking to engage with China's vast market, what are the implications? Understanding this history, the negative list, the function of VIEs, why they were tolerated, and why that changed as your source lays out, becomes absolutely crucial for navigating this evolving environment. It's not the same landscape it was 5 or 10 years ago.
So, what does this all mean for you? Well, perhaps the next time you see a headline about China's tech sector, you'll view it through this lens we've discussed, not just as a reaction, maybe, but as a deliberate move by a nation actively managing its complex transition into a new economic phase.
It certainly raises that fundamental question, really, for any economy, doesn't it? How much government guidance and control is truly necessary to achieve stability and fairness? And critically, at what point does that control potentially risk stifling the very innovation and dynamism it once benefited from? Finding that balance, that's the challenge.
A lot to think about indeed. We hope this deep dive into your source material has given you a clearer, perhaps more nuanced picture of the powerful forces shaping China's tech future.